a watchmaker, a mechanical beetle, a secret worth killing for. Dive into this fast-paced Sherlock Holmes adventure through the foggy docks of Victorian London. Chapter 1. The Watchmaker of Whitechapel. Have you ever held a secret in your hands, cold as metal, bright as a jewel, and known at once that it could ruin you? I set these pages down as plainly as I can, with no desire for drama and no talent for invention. If the tale sounds extravagant, remember that London itself is extravagant, its wealth and want, its churches and courts, its laboratories and gin shops, its noblemen and its knifemen, pressed together until the whole city seems to steam. What you are about to read is copied from my own notebook, stained with oil and spirit varnish, and written in the back room of my shop in Whitechapel during the wet spring of 1894. I was, at that time, a watchmaker by trade, one of those quiet craftsmen who live by the patience of their fingers and the reliability of wheels. You may never have heard my name. That is as it should be. My name is Arthur Pendleton. The shop stood on a narrow lane off Whitechapel Road, where the paving stones were always black, even in sunshine, from the soot that fell like flour from the sky. A man could walk there at noon and still have the lamps hissing above him like tired insects. The air tasted of coal smoke, boiled cabbage, horse sweat, damp wool, and, from certain doors, the sour-sweet reek of spilled gin. At night the streets did not so much grow darker as they grew alive. You could hear the markets closing, barrows rattling, crates thumping, voices sharpening with fatigue. You could hear the costermongers calling the last of their oranges and winkles. You could hear, too, the quick little whispers that slid from mouth to mouth when a constable turned a corner. News of a brawl, a woman found in a stairwell, a child gone missing, a sailor robbed and left with his head split open like a melon. The newspapers had long since made Whitechapel into a word that respectable people spoke softly, as if the syllables carried infection. Yet even in that district the hours kept their own propriety. Morning belonged to workmen and shopkeepers. Afternoon belonged to tired mothers and hungry children. Evening belonged to the men who came seeking what they were too proud to ask for in daylight. And behind it all always was the rhythm of the place, boots on stone, wheels on ruts, the clang of a smith's hammer, and the small faithful ticking of my bench clock. My workroom was narrow, with a window that looked upon the alley. The glass was never clean for longer than a day. Soot settled upon it as if it were its rightful home. Inside, however, I kept order. There is a particular kind of comfort in order. It is not the comfort of softness or warmth, but of certainty. A watch does not flatter you. It does not lie. It does not mean well. It performs, or it fails, and when it fails, it does so by rules. My bench ran under the window, scarred with years of screws and file marks. Above it were shelves with small drawers, each labelled in my hand. Balance staffs, pallet stones, mainsprings, escape wheels, jewels assorted. A row of watch glasses sat in their paper envelopes like pale, sleeping eyes. There were bottles too, benzine for cleaning, alcohol for spirits, oil in a tiny vial with a needle-fine spout, a brass caliper hung on a hook. My staking set stood to the right like a little iron temple. In the center, on a mat of green baize, lay whatever patient had been brought to me that day. Most often a working man's lever watch, battered and stubborn, or a lady's bracelet timepiece so delicate that it seemed made for a child's wrist. What you must understand, if you are to understand anything that follows, is that watchmaking is not simply the repair of time. It is the management of force. A mainspring is a captured violence. You wound it, and it strains to unwind. You harness that strain through a train of wheels, each tooth taking a portion of the labor. The escapement, whether lever, cylinder, or one of the older contrivances, releases that force in controlled bites. The balance wheel returns it to regularity, oscillating like a thought that cannot settle, and the hairspring tempers the whole into something like discipline. A watch is a small argument against chaos. I had always preferred the infallible logic of such mechanisms to the disordered unpredictability of human nature. Human beings arrived at my counter with stories, always stories. The watch, by contrast, arrived mute. It told the truth the moment you lifted the back. Chapter 2. The Mahogany Box. That Tuesday, rainy, raw, and hard, with the sort of wind that slices through a coat and finds the ribs, said he. I had been working upon a gentleman's chronograph with a stubborn minute recorder. The hand would jump, then stall, as if the watch were hesitant to remember. It was a fine piece, Swiss, with a blued steel column wheel, and I confess that its cleverness had me in a kind of friendly contest with its maker. I had just removed the bridge and was examining the teeth under my loupe when I heard the bell at the shop door. The bell was not a clear sound. The air in my shop thickened it, and the rain outside softened it, so that it came to me like a dull knock in the distance. I glanced up, expecting some regular Harker with her kitchen clock that always lost courage, or old Mr. Mowbray, whose silver watch had been pawned and redeemed so many times that it seemed ashamed of itself. Instead, a stranger stood in my doorway. He filled it in a way that made my shop appear smaller than it was. He wore a coachman's coat, heavy and dark, with rain beaded upon it. The collar was turned up, and a scarf silk, I thought, though I only saw it for a moment, was drawn high upon his throat. His hat brim shadowed his eyes. He did not look about him as most customers did. His gaze did not take in the shelves, the clocks, the pendulums, the watches in their glass cases. He looked directly at me as if he had been here before, though I was certain I had never seen him. In his hands he held a box. Not a parcel, not a wrapped bundle, an actual box, naked to the wet air. It was of mahogany, dark as old blood, polished to a low gleam that the rain could not entirely spoil. Its corners were fitted with brass. It was not large, no longer than my forearm, but it had a weight to it that showed in the stranger's grip. He set it down upon my counter with a care that was, in itself, a kind of message. No words, no greeting, no name offered. He only placed the box before me, as if laying a card on a table, and rested his gloved fingertips upon the lid. From him came a scent I did not expect in Whitechapel's sea salt, sharp and clean, and the faint, sweet sting of expensive tobacco. It clung to the damp wool of his coat, a ghost of other places. Docks at dawn, perhaps, a ship's cabin, a club where men spoke in low voices and never looked at the clock. I waited for him to speak. In that pause, the whole shop seemed to listen, the wall clock, the little French carriage clock under its glass dome. My bench clock with its steady, homely tick. When he did not speak, I said what any tradesman would. "Can I help you, sir?" He did not answer. His hand moved, and for a moment I thought he would open the box. Instead, he slid it toward me, an inch, no more. And then, with a slight inclination of his head, he turned and left. That is the plain truth. He came in, set down the box, pushed it toward me, and went out again without a sound. The bell gave its dull note a second time as the door closed. I stepped quickly to the window, but the alley was already empty. The rain fell harder, knocking small splashes from the stones. A cart passed at the end of the lane, the horses' hooves sending water up in brief arcs. A woman hurried by with her shawl over her head. Shoulders hunched as if the weather were a personal insult. The stranger was gone. I stood there for a full minute, my hand on the counter, looking down at the mahogany box as if it might begin to speak on his behalf. You will say, perhaps, that I should have taken it at once to the police. You may even say that I should have left it where it lay and locked my door. But in my trade, curiosity is not a vice. It is a tool. A watchmaker who is not curious is merely a cleaner of cases. He will never understand why a pivot has worn, why a jewel has cracked, why an escapement has bruised its own teeth. Curiosity is the difference between replacing and knowing. So I drew the box toward me. The brass fittings were warm, oddly enough, as if the box had been close to a body. The mahogany was smooth under my fingertips, the grain tight and handsome. The workmanship was excellent, the lid sat flush. The corners true, the brass screws aligned with an almost fussy precision. There was no maker's mark that I could see. A small keyhole sat at the front. I tried the lid gently. It did not give. Now I keep keys, hundreds of them, for clocks and cabinets and old cases whose owners have lost their own. I selected a thin brass key that seemed near in size and offered it to the keyhole. It slid in as if it had been made for it. That should have warned me. I turned it. Inside the lock there was a small, clean click, the kind one hears when a well-made detent releases. I lifted the lid. Chapter 3. The Anatomy of the Beetle. The scent that rose was not that of powder or perfume, but of machine oil, fine oil, not the coarse stuff used on cart axles, mixed with something mineral, like the smell of stone after rain. The interior of the box was lined with velvet, a dark green so deep it might have been black in poorer light. Set into the velvet, held by two slim brass clips, was an object that, for a moment, my mind refused to name. It was shaped like a beetle. Not a crude child's ornament, not a brooch, not a dead insect preserved under glass. This was an artifact deliberate, precise, and so strangely alive in its stillness that my throat tightened before I understood why. Its body was carved from opal, not the milky opal one sees in cheap jewelry, but fire opal rich and translucent, with color caught inside it, as if the stone were holding a sunset captive. When I moved my head slightly, the colors shifted red to green, green to gold, gold to a cold blue at the edges. It was as though light had been chopped into shards and set within. The legs were gold, no, not merely gold-colored but actual gold, by the look and weight of them. Each leg was jointed, with tiny pins at the joints so small that my naked eye could not follow the workmanship. The feet ended in minute hooks, each one sharpened and polished. Along the underside, beneath the jewel body, I could see a seam so fine it seemed a trick of the light, suggesting a removable plate. At the head were two delicate feelers, fine as watch springs, curving forward like antennae. They trembled, not from motion of their own, but from the faint vibration of the world I eyes my breath, the movement of my hands, the constant ticking of clocks. And in the center of its back, where a beetle's carapace would be smooth, there was a tiny aperture, a slot no wider than a pin's head. A winding square. My fingers, without my permission, reached for my loop. I set it in my eye and leaned closer. The opal had been cut so that the facets did not merely please the gaze, they served as windows. Through them I saw impossibly a skeleton of brass and steel within, a tiny train of wheels like a watch laid on its side. A balance, perhaps, though it was not where I expected. A spring barrel, though it was not shaped as any barrel should be. It was a mechanism, certainly, but one built in a geometry that made my mind itch. This was not a toy. This was not even, in the usual sense, jewellery. It was a machine disguised as a jewel, disguised as an insect. Beneath it, tucked under the velvet, was an envelope. It was thick paper, cream-colored, its flap sealed with a spot of black wax. The seal bore no crest I recognized. The address was written in a hand that made my stomach contract tight, sloping letters with a disciplined impatience, as if the writer despised the very act of putting ink to paper. It was, in all essential particulars, the hand of Sherlock Holmes. I had seen it only once before. Years earlier, how many, I cannot now be sure, there had come into my shop a gentleman with a hawk's nose and eyes that seemed to measure a room in the way a watchmaker measures a wheel. He had brought a stopwatch, an instrument used, he said, for timing a man's running pace. It was nothing remarkable, and the repair had been trivial. Yet the man's manner was not trivial. He spoke as one who thought aloud, not caring who heard, and when his eyes fell upon my bench he made, in a single glance, remarks that were so exact regarding my tools and habits that I felt as if my pockets had been turned out in the street. He paid me, thanked me, and left. Only later did I understand who he had been. Now his hand lay before me again, after Reichenbach, after the newspapers had mourned him, after the world had arranged itself to proceed without him. My mouth had gone dry. I did not open the envelope at once. I set it beside the beetle and sat down at my bench as if my legs no longer trusted me. Outside, Whitechapel went on with its day. A cart rattled by. Someone shouted. The rain hammered the window with a steady insistence. Inside, the clocks ticked. I do not know how long I stared at the beetle before I dared touch it. At last, with the same care I would use in lifting a balance assembly from its cock, I slid a thin spatula beneath the insect's body and raised it from its velvet cradle. It had weight more than a brute should. It lay in my palm cold at first, then warming quickly. The gold legs did not move. Yet as I held it, I felt through the skin of my hand a faint tremor, like the purring of a cat too distant to hear. Mechanisms should not purr. I set it on my baize mat and leaned close again with my loop. Along the seam underneath I saw 2-minute screws, each one slotted so finely that an ordinary screwdriver would ruin it. I selected my smallest dot ground by my own hand until its blade was narrow as a needle. As I turned the first screw, I felt resistance, then the sudden give. When a thread releases its hold, the second followed. I lifted the plate. Within was a world. There were wheels, yes, small brass wheels with teeth like grains of rice and pinions so fine they looked like combs for insects. There was a spring, coiled tight in a barrel no larger than a pea. There was an escapement of a kind I had never seen, not a lever, not a cylinder, but a curious forked contrivance that seemed designed to receive impulses from 2 directions. And there, set like a heart in the center, was a stone, a pale opal, smaller than a fingernail, mounted on a little spindle. It had the look of a jewel used as a bearing, yet it was not a jewel in the ordinary sense, for it was cut with lines. Under magnification, those lines resolved into characters, tiny marks arranged in a ring, like a watch dial that had forgotten numbers and learned instead an alphabet of scratches. I felt the hairs rise along my arms. For a watchmaker, the strangest thing about the mechanism was not its beauty, but its intention. A watch intends to keep time. A repeating watch intends to sing the time. A chronograph intends to measure intervals. Every part serves that end. This thing served something else. As I watched, the tiny opal spindle turned slowly, almost imperceptibly driven by the hidden force of the spring. It made a fraction of a rotation, then paused. Another fraction, then pause again as if an unseen hand were feeding it in measured bites. Not a watch then. A cipher machine. I had read of such things only in passing. In the papers one occasionally saw mention of naval signals, of codes and ciphers, of dispatches that meant nothing unless you held the key. In my youth I had amused myself with a book of puzzles that included simple substitution ciphers. But this was beyond parlor tricks. This was the marriage of engineering and secrecy, and it had been placed silently in my shop. The envelope now seemed heavier than the beetle itself. I broke the wax seal with my thumbnail. The wax cracked cleanly. I unfolded the paper. Inside was not a letter in plain English, but a sheet covered in symbols rows of marks, dots, slashes, and little hooked lines that might have been shorthand, or might have been the scribbling of a madman. Between these rows were occasional numbers, written in the same firm hand, and at the bottom a single line in ordinary script edi. For the watchmaker who mends what others dare not name. No signature, yet the hand was Holmes's hand, and the sentence had that cold courtesy which I remembered. You may ask, at this point, why I did not simply burn it all. The note, the beetle, the box, and wash my hands of the matter. I ask myself the same question now, with the comfort of distance. The answer is simple and shameful price, because I wanted to know, and because, even then, even in Whitechapel, one did not so easily refuse the call of a mind like Holmes's, whether the call was direct or only implied by ink and mechanism. I set the paper on my bench and began, as any man of my trade would begin, with the physical facts. First, said he, the beetle had a spring, and it was wound. Second, the opal spindle bore characters in a ring, and it advanced in steps, suggesting a ratchet or a detent, perhaps controlled by the escapement. Third, the paper bore symbols and numbers, likely meant to correspond with positions of the spindle. I took up a pencil and wrote the numbers as I saw them: 3, 7, 12, 1, 9, repeating in a pattern that was not quite regular. Beside each number on the sheet were clusters of symbols. If the beetle were the key, then the numbers might indicate settings, quote, like a watch dial that must be aligned to a mark. I examined the beetle's back again, and there near the head, almost hidden in the opal facets, was a tiny mark like a scratch. Under the loop it became a deliberate line, a reference point. A datum. In watchmaking, a datum is sacred. Without it, you cannot set the beat, cannot align the impulse jewel, cannot judge where true center lies. My heart beat quickened. I placed the beetle on the mat, turned it gently until the opal spindle's ring of scratches aligned with the datum mark, and watched. The mechanism paused. Then, with a faint internal click, so soft I felt it more than heard it, the spindle advanced one step, as if acknowledging that it had been set. I lifted the paper again. The first number was 3. I turned the spindle very carefully, using the finest pair of tweezers 3 steps from the datum. Each step came with that faint click. Now, if this were a cipher, what would happen? For a long time, nothing. And then, so quietly that my breath caught, I heard another sound. Not from the clocks, from the beetle. A thin metallic snick, like a latch releasing. One of the gold legs moved. It moved no more than a hair's breadth, but it moved with intention. The joint bent, the foot shifted, and the whole beetle's posture changed, as if it had awakened from sleep. I sat back, my chair scraping the floorboards. This was no mere ornament. In that moment, the whole of Whitechapel seemed to press at my window. The rain, the cries, the rumble of wheels, the distant laughter from a public house, everything sounded farther away, muffled, as if I had stepped into a smaller, more private world. I forced myself to lean in again. The leg had moved to reveal something beneath it, a second slot in the opal, concealed by the leg's former position. It was shaped like a keyway, an opening that would accept some small insert. A missing piece. A missing second. My throat tightened around the thought, and with it came a fear I had not yet allowed myself to feel, that whatever this device was designed to do, it was designed to do it only when complete. And that someone, somewhere, intended that completion to happen on a schedule. I looked to my bench clock. Its hands were steady, uncaring. It was 3:15. Time, which I had always treated as a servant, had suddenly become a master. I returned to the note and began again, this time not as a curious craftsman, but as a man who suspects he has been made a tool. The symbols were arranged in groups of 5 or 6, separated by small dashes. Between certain groups was a dot, larger than the others, like a full stop. Some groups repeated. The numbers 3, 7, 12, 1, 9 appeared at intervals, always at the start of a line, as if marking a new instruction. A watchmaker's mind looks for repetition. It looks for periodicity. It looks for what returns. I copied the first line carefully into my notebook, preserving each mark. Then I took a sheet of clean paper and began a tally a galais. How often did each symbol appear? Which groups repeated? Which never returned? It was a slow, dull labor, the kind that makes hours pass unnoticed, except that now each hour felt like a thing with weight, something that could fall. As I worked, the light in my shop changed. The day outside darkened early with the rain. Gas lamps flared to life, their glow pushing in at the window in a smeared rectangle. The sound of Whitechapel altered too, more footsteps, more voices, the clatter of plates from a nearby eating-house, the occasional burst of song from a public house where men drank against the cold. At some point I realized that I was no longer alone in the shop. Not in fact, no one had entered. The door remained shut. But in sensation. The mahogany box sat on the counter like a silent witness. The beetle lay on my baize with one leg slightly raised, as if it listened. The note stared up at me with its rows of marks. And somewhere behind all of it, like a presence just out of sight, was the mind that had arranged this. Holmes's mind, perhaps, or the mind of a man who wished to reach him. I had reached a point in my tally when the bell rang again. I started so violently that my pencil snapped. I looked to the door. For a second I expected to see the stranger returned, dripping rain, empty-handed, ready to take back what he had delivered. Instead, there was no one in the doorway. The bell had rung without the door opening. A drought, then. A vibration in the building. Whitechapel is full of such tricks. Yet my skin prickled all the same. I rose and went to the door. The street beyond was blurred with rain and gaslight. A pair of boys ran by with their caps pulled low, laughing. Across the way a woman stood under an awning, her face pale in the lamp glow, watching nothing in particular. I shut the door and locked it. Then, as if that small act of caution unlocked another, I returned to the bench and forced myself to be methodical. I had numbers. I had a datum mark. I had a mechanism that responded to settings by revealing a concealed keyway. What I did not have was the key. So I did the only thing I could do. I continued to decipher. The first true success came not by cleverness, but by patience. One group of symbols occurred at the start of 3 separate lines, each time preceded by a different number. It was, in effect, a constant. In ordinary writing, such a constant might be the, for the appears everywhere in English like a nail in a shoe. I took the group and assigned it, tentatively, to the. Then I looked for another common group, one that often followed it. There was a cluster 2 slashes and a hook that appeared repeatedly after the the group. I guessed, again tentatively, that it might be a noun man, box, key, time. It was a fool's work, perhaps. Yet as the evening wore on, the fog of symbols began just at the edges to show shapes. A few letters emerged like faces in a crowd. And then, with a suddenness that made my stomach drop, I saw a word that could not be mistaken. "Docs, you," said I. I sat back, staring at it. The docks, not far in miles, but far in Kyngen, entire kingdom of ropes and tar, of cargo and drink, of foreign tongues and hard fists. A place where a man could vanish as easily as a coin in the Thames. I looked at the beetle again. Its opal body caught the gaslight and threw back a red glint, as if it had an eye. The mahogany box, so carefully made, so silently delivered, had brought the docks into my shop like a summons. I copied the partial, deciphering into my note. The sentence was incomplete, ragged with unknown symbols, but it had the shape of an instruction, the dock at a time, perhaps. A place, certainly. I glanced once more at my bench clock. 6:30. Outside, Whitechapel was turning into its night self. The rain had eased, but the fog thickened, turning lamp halos into floating bruises of light. Somewhere a baby cried. Somewhere a man coughed deep and wet. The cough of those who work in dust and never escape it. I remember with unpleasant clarity how my hands shook as I reassembled the Beetle's underside plate and tightened its microscopic screws. A watchmaker's hands are meant to be steady. Mine were not. I placed the insect back into the velvet cradle. I folded the coded note and returned it to its envelope, though I did not reseal it. I closed the box and turned the key in the lock, then put the key into my waistcoat pocket. Finally, I sat down in the small chair behind my counter and listened to the sound of my shop. Tick, tick, tick. All my life the ticking had been reassurance. That evening it became a threat. For the first time, I truly considered, that the mechanism in that opal body might not be measuring time at all, but consuming it. That it might be counting down towards something that would happen, whether or not I understood. And in that thought, as in the faint movement of the beetle's leg, I sensed the outline of a larger design. A hand reaching out from the shadows of London, using my trade, my order, my certainty as the very means to deliver disorder. You may think, reading this, that I am an excitable man. I am not. I have spent hours coaxing a bent hairspring back into true, and I have not sworn. I have watched a mainspring snap and whip itself into a knot, and I have not shouted. I have repaired watches that were dropped from docks into salt water and survived, and I have not called it a miracle. Yet I tell you plainly, when I finally put out the lamps and climbed the narrow stairs to my rooms above the shop, I did so with the feeling that something small and bright and terrible lay waiting below. Something that had entered my life without knocking, and that would not leave when asked. I slept poorly. In my dreams I heard the click of a detent, and the tiny, patient stepping of a wheel. In the morning the rain had stopped, but Whitechapel looked dirtier for it, as if the wet had only spread the soot more evenly. A thin fog crawled along the street like a living thing. I opened the shop and set my bench in order, though my mind was elsewhere. The mahogany box sat where I had left it. I unlocked it. The beetle lay still, perfect as a jewel on a corpse. Yet when I lifted it, I felt again that faint internal tremor. Whatever spring drove, it had not spent itself in the night. I took out the note, spread it on the bench, and returned to the work of deciphering, more urgently now. The word docks stared at me like an accusation. By noon I had drawn out more fragments, enough to form a second phrase. Mahogany is, said he. It made no sense yet, for the missing parts were too many. But the appearance of mahogany sent a chill through me. The box itself was mahogany. The note knew it. The note spoke of it. The note was not merely a message, it was an awareness. Chapter 4. The Missing Second. As I traced the symbols, an idea came, sudden as a spark in oil. What if the beetle was not only a key to the code, but a key to the box? What if the box contained more than the beetle and the paper? I examined the interior again. The velvet lining seemed fixed. But velvet can conceal seams, and mahogany can hide compartments as easily as it shows its grain. I ran my fingernail along the inner edge. At one corner I felt a minute irregularity, no more than a breath of difference. I pressed. The velvet gave slightly, and the wood beneath moved. A hidden panel slid aside with a soft, well-oiled whisper. Inside the cavity was a second object. A thin strip of metal, wrapped in oiled paper. I unfolded it. It was a gear. Not a watch gear, not exactly. It was larger than it ought to have been for the beetle's scale, and its teeth were cut in an unusual pattern, alternating long and short, as if meant to engage with a wheel that did not have regular spacing. Along its rim were stamped tiny marks, numbers, perhaps, or letters, so faint I needed my loupe to read them. And on one face, etched with a fine graver, was a single word. Second. My breath came out in a sound like laughter, though there was no humor in it. So there it was. The missing second. The box had carried its own completion all along. Why, then, had it been concealed? Why deliver a puzzle and hide its answer in the same hand? Unless the true puzzle was not finding the gear, but deciding whether to fit it. I held the gear between my tweezers and looked at the beetle's underside, where the concealed keyway waited beneath the raised leg. My trade has taught me that when you force a part into a place it does not belong, you ruin both part and place. A man can do irreparable harm with the smallest impatience. So I did not force it. I examined. I measured. I laid the gear beside the opening and compared the tooth pitch by eye. It matched. The precision of it was terrifying. I fitted it. The gear slid into the keyway and seated with a gentle, satisfying firmness, as if the beetle had been incomplete only in the way a sentence is incomplete without its final word. For a moment nothing happened. Then the beetle moved. Not a twitch. Not a single leg. The entire mechanism came alive with a delicacy that was worse than violence. The gold legs articulated in sequence, each joint bending with the grace of a living creature. The antennae lifted. The opal body seemed to glow as it caught the daylight and threw it back in shifting fire. And from within, faint but distinct, came the sound of a running train, tiny teeth taking hold, a spring unwinding, an escapement metering out force in quick, precise bites. Tick, 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 faster than any watch I had ever serviced. The beetle crawled. Across my baize mat it advanced a full inch, then stopped. Its head angled toward the coded note as if it could read. I sat frozen, my loupe still in one eye, absurd in my terror. The beetle's back aperture, the winding square, turned of its own accord, aligning to the datum mark. Then, with a click, it advanced 3 steps. 3, the first number of the note. It advanced again 7 steps, then paused. 7. Then 12, then 1, then 9. Each time it moved, the internal tick accelerated for a heartbeat, then steadied again, as if the machine were thinking. and as it reached each setting, the symbols on the paper seemed impossibly to become less random. Of course, they did not change. The ink remained ink. Yet my mind, given the rhythm and the sequence, suddenly saw the pattern. It was not simple substitution. It was polyalphabetic shifting key. The beetle was providing the shift. Holmes, or whoever wrote in his hand, had not merely sent a message. He had sent the means to read it in the correct order, at the correct pace. I bent to the paper and began to write the deciphered letters as the beetle counted through its settings. The first clear sentence formed slowly, like a photograph appearing in a tray. The box is the beetle. I stared at the words, then at the mahogany case, then back at the living jewel on my mat. A second sentence followed, and with it came the true hook of the thing, the line that pulled me, unwilling, out of my shop and into the machinery of another man's war ticket to the docks at 9. Beneath that was another fragment, half-born do not police he. I did not finish it then. My pencil hovered. My fingers ached from gripping it too tightly. Outside my window, a wagon passed with a load of barrels, the iron hoops clanking like chains. 9. That gave me only the afternoon. I looked down at my hands that knew the safe, honest violence of springs and wheels, and realized they had been recruited into something that did not care whether I lived. The beetle, having delivered its sequence, fell still again. The ticking ceased. It sat upon the baize, opal bright in the grey day, like a small, priceless sin. I closed the mahogany box, not to hide the beetle from the world, but to hide the world from myself for a moment. I stood very quietly in my shop, listening to the ordinary clocks. Tick, 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 and in that familiar sound I heard, beneath it, the echo of the beetle's faster count, like a second heartbeat laid over my own. This is where I must pause in my copying, for what followed that afternoon and night belongs to the streets, and to the docks, and to a man whose name you already know, though at the time I believed him dead. But if you would understand the first turning of the wheel, how a watchmaker of Whitechapel came to hold a jewel insect that could read a cipher, then you have it here, in full, without summaries, without headings, without any comfort except the truth. Chapter 5. Through the Fog of Spitalfields. Have you ever walked out of your own door and felt the street close behind you like a trap? I had done it 1,000 times, and yet when I stepped from my shop that afternoon, it was as if the very hinge of my life had been oiled in secret and turned to a new position. Whitechapel was the same Whitechapel in brick, stained with soot, window panes clouded by grime. The thin cry of hawkers, and the heavier mutter of men who had worked too long for too little. But I was not the same. I locked the door. I checked it. I checked it again. It is the habit of craftsmen to mistrust their first attempt. A screw is tightened, then tested. A jewel is seated, then pressed. Even a simple latch is tried twice, not because one expects it to fail, but because one cannot afford to be wrong. My fingers were still marked with oil from the beetle's underside. In my waistcoat pocket, the key to the mahogany box lay like a sliver of cold gilt. I had wrapped the box itself in brown paper, tied it with twine, and placed it in a plain canvas satchel. No one who saw me in the street would think I carried anything more remarkable than a clock weight or a set of tools. That, at least, was my hope. I set off westward first, not because the docks lay west, they did not, but because I wanted to be seen going one way before I turned another. It was a small precaution, and perhaps a foolish one, yet it soothed me in the manner of small familiar motions. A watchmaker, when uncertain, returns to the thing he can do. He checks the alignment. He tests the end-shake. He listens for an even beat. I listened. Whitechapel sounded wrong. The fog had thickened through the afternoon until the street lamps, still unlit, wore pale halos in the dirty air. The day was not dark, yet everything looked as if it had been rubbed with ash. Faces appeared and vanished at 10 paces. A cart came out of the mist like an animal nosing its way through a hedge. The driver hunched and swearing softly at the horse. And always there was damp a wetness that did not fall from the sky so much as rise from the stones. The cobbles shone. The gutters ran with black water. A man's boots made a sucking sound as he walked, as if the street wished to keep him. Spitalfields lay not far, but the path to it, through lanes that kinked and narrowed, through little courts where washing hung like pale flags, felt longer than it should have. I passed the market buildings, their ironwork looming like the ribs of some dead creature. The stalls were closing, yet the scent of them remained bruised fruit, fish, damp straw, and the sharp, peppery breath of crushed herbs. Women with red hands moved like tired machines, stacking baskets. Boys darted between barrows, bold as rats. I kept my pace ordinary. That was vital. A man who hurries in the East End is either late for work, late for a fight, or late for the law. I was none of these, and I wished to look like I belonged. But I did not belong. The satchel's strap cut at my shoulder. I adjusted it once, then forced myself not to touch it again. To fidget is to advertise. To glance back is to confess fear. I fixed my gaze ahead and walked as if I were on an errand for a customer who would scold me for delay. At the corner of a narrow lane, I stopped to examine a shop window, an act of pretense, for the window contained only cheap tinware and cracked plates. In the glass I watched the street behind me. A figure passed, then another. Then, after a pause long enough to give me hope, a third. He wore a dark coat, and at his throat was a pale strip that might have been a scarf. As he walked, he did not look about him with the vacant curiosity of a visitor. His eyes kept to the line of the street as if he were reading it. I told myself it was coincidence. Whitechapel is full of dark coats. It is full of men who wear scarves against the damp. Yet my skin tightened in a way it had no business to do over such trivial facts. I walked on. A public-house door opened, spilling warm air and the roar of voices. For a moment I smelled ale and pipe smoke, and heard the harsh laughter of men who had decided, for an hour, to forget their own names. The door shut, and the sound was snuffed as if someone had pinched a candle. The fog thickened further as I drew closer to the river. It changed character. In Spitalfields it was a grey veil, softened by market steam. In the East End streets, nearer the docks, it became heavier, with a brackish tang that spoke of water and rotting wood. It clung to my eyelashes. It gathered in my moustache. It lay on my lips like a film. The city grew less domestic and more industrial. The brick walls seemed taller. The alleys seemed emptier. Here and there I saw the shadow of a crane arm, black against a paler black. The cobbles were scarred by heavy wheels. The puddles held rainbow skins of oil. I checked my watch, a plain lever watch, English, one I trusted because I had rebuilt it twice and knew the character of its faults. It was 7:45, too early to arrive at 9 and not early enough to return. That is a peculiar hour. It belongs neither to safety nor to decision. It is the hour in which a man finds himself committed by the mere passing of minutes. I had read once of a certain method used by those who fear they are followed, the sudden turn, the quick reversal, the act of crossing to the opposite pavement without reason. It is a thing easier imagined than performed, for it requires a boldness that feels like madness when one is alone. At a junction where 3 lanes met, I performed my own small test. I entered a narrow passage between 2 warehouses, walked to its end, and emerged into a court where barrels stood stacked like giant children's toys. There I paused as if searching my pocket for a match. Then I turned and retraced my steps. If I were followed, I would meet my follower coming the other way. My heart hammered with the absurdity of it. The satchel seemed to weigh more with every breath. Halfway down the passage, a shape loomed out of the fog. A man. He halted the moment he saw me. In that instant, through the haze, I caught the pale line at his throat again, the silk scarf, wrapped with a certain careless elegance that the poor do not affect. His hat brim was low. His hands were in his pockets. He did not speak, nor did I. We stood for a second like 2 figures placed on a board by an unseen player. Then, with a smoothness that had no trace of surprise, he stepped aside, letting me pass. I walked by, every nerve screaming at my body to run. As I passed, I smelled him expensive tobacco again, overlaid with something sharp and clean like bay rum. The same scent as the stranger who delivered the box. My legs did not buckle, though they wished to. I reached the end of the passage and emerged into the street beyond. I did not look back. I forced my pace to remain the same. You will think, perhaps, that I should have fled then. You will say I had proof enough, and that only a fool walks toward danger when danger has already taken the time to announce itself. Yet the sentence in my mind repeated itself with a craftsman's stubbornness. Take it to the docks at 9. Instructions, once accepted, are hard to shake. A watchmaker who has begun to disassemble a movement does not stop halfway. He must go on, even if the spring is under tension, even if a single slip will ruin the thing. And there was another thought, colder than fierce. If they were watching me now, they had been watching me from the moment I fitted the missing second. The Beetle had been tested, so now, it seemed, was I. I turned my route, keeping to the busier lanes where possible. But even the busier lanes were not busy in the way of the West End. They were busy with work and with hunger. Men carried loads on their backs, shoulders hunched against the damp. A woman argued with a butcher, her voice high and raw. 2 children sat on a doorstep sharing a crust, their eyes large and incurious. No one looked at me twice. That, too, was a kind of loneliness. When at last I reached the dockside streets, the air changed again. It grew colder and more metallic, as if the river had filed its edge. The buildings grew larger, their doors wider. A wagon creaked past, piled with coils of rope. A sailor staggered along the pavement, singing under his breath in a language I did not recognize. Chapter 6. The Anchor and Crow. And then I saw through the fog the sign I had been seeking. It hung above a low door and showed, by the faint light of a lamp, a painted anchor and a black bird. Beneath it, in letters that had once been white, were the words "The Anchor and Crow." I had never been inside. That alone made it useful. Familiar places are watched. Unfamiliar places are only watched if one has been led there. I hesitated at the threshold, listening. From within came the sound of voices and the clink of glass. A burst of laughter, then a cough. A moment later, the mournful scraping of a fiddle began, hesitant at first, then settling into a tune that made the hairs on my arms stand dotter, one of those melodies that seems to have been written by a man who knows he will die poor. I pushed open the door. Warmth struck my face like a hand. The air inside was thick with smoke, damp wool, and spilled beer. Lamps burned with a yellow glare, turning every face into a half-mask of shadow and light. The floor was sticky underfoot. The room was crowded, not with gentlemen, but with dock labourers, sailors, and men who looked as if they had not seen a clean sheet in months. I chose a table at the side, where the wall met a small window filmed with grime. From there I could see the door and most of the room. I sat with my back to the wall, as I had once seen Holmes do in my shop, without seeming to think about it. The thought of him then was so sharp it might have been pain. A barmaid came broad-shouldered, hair pinned harshly back, a red mark on one cheek as if someone had struck her earlier in the day. "What'll you have?" she demanded. "Beer," I said. "Something hot, if you have it. I've been breathing fog since noon." "You and the whole river," she retorted, and slapped a mug down as if it had offended her personally. I forced myself to drink. The beer had the taste of metal and bitter yeast. It did no good, yet it gave my hands employment. While I drank, I watched. 2 men at the bar wore scarves. Not wool, silk. I knew the difference now, had learned it in the most unpleasant of classrooms. One scarf was pale grey, the other so dark it seemed black until the lamp caught it and revealed a raven sheen. They stood too still for labourers. They spoke too little for sailors. They were waiting. I kept my eyes low and my ears wide. It is astonishing, the things you hear when you are not meant to. "They say the little clockman's on his way," murmured the pale grey scarf. "Aye," answered the raven scarf, "and if he ain't, we fetch him, like any other parcel." A third voice joined them, a man with a finer coat than the room deserved, though he tried to hide it beneath dockside grime. No fuss. No blood in the taproom. Mr. Lathbury don't like fuss. "Mr. Lathbury," said the pale grey scarf, with a hint of respect that curdled my stomach. So there was a name. I glanced at my watch, making a show of impatience as any man might who waited for a friend. 8:49. The minutes crawled like lame insects. At 8:52 the door opened, bringing in a draught of fog and a figure in a cap. He paused just within, as if letting his eyes adjust. A pale strip at his throat flashed under the lamp. Silk again. 3 of them now. Perhaps more. That is the trouble in such places. Your enemy is the room itself. At 8:55, the faintest ticking began from within my satchel. Tick, tick, tick. It was wrong in tempo, too eager, too exact. No tavern clock makes that sound. It was the beetle, waking. I slid my hand into the satchel as though merely shifting the strap. The mahogany box vibrated against my fingertips with a delicate internal motion, like a watch case when the balance is running high. My mouth went dry. The men in scarves did not react, or, if they did it with the subtlety of practiced hunters. At 8:58, the barmaid returned and nodded at my mug. "You're nursing that like it's holy," she said. "I'm waiting for a man," I replied. "Ain't we all?" she said, and moved away. Then 9. Chapter 7. The 9 p.m. Stranger. The door opened. Fog rolled in like a thing with intent, and out of it stepped a figure in a long coat. He shut the door behind him with a care that suggested good manners, and he stood for a moment near the bar, as though he had come for nothing more than a drink. He did not remove his hat. The brim shadowed his eyes, yet his posture made my stomach turn. He carried himself as if he were alone in the room even when he was not. He approached the bar. The barman, a thick-necked fellow with a nose like a bruised plum, leaned forward. "Evenin'." The stranger did not order. He spoke softly, and the softness carried. My name sounded in that smoky room like a dropped coin, small, bright, and impossible to ignore. Every nerve in me tightened. I did not rise. I forced myself to look up without haste. "I believe," I said, "you have the advantage of me." He turned slightly, and the lamp caught his jawline. A thin scar lay there, pale as chalk. His eyes, when they met mine, were indeed pale grey, almost colourless. They held the room as if it were no more than a diagram. "I have the advantage of most men," he replied, "but we will call it convenience. You have something that belongs, temporarily, to my associates." "Your associates have a taste for silk," I said, surprising myself. A flicker crossed his face, amusement or irritation. "Silk is practical," he said. "It does not itch, it does not fray quickly. It also whispers when it rubs cloth. Some men enjoy the reminder that they are not invisible." The raven scarf laughed softly at that. The pale grey scarf shifted a step, placing himself in the line between me and the door. I felt the room tighten around me. The pale-eyed man, Lathbury, then spoke again. "You received a box. You opened it. You fitted a part you found within." He watched my face as he spoke, as a man watches a dial for the moment a hand aligns. "You found," he continued, "the missing second." The beetles ticking in my satchel ceased at that precise phrase, as if the machine itself understood English. Lathbury's pale eyes narrowed fractionally. "There. Do you hear it? The little creature listens." "I hear nothing," I lied. He smiled. "Good. You are learning." The men with scarves began to drift. Not close enough to touch me, not far enough to allow escape. A ring forms without announcing itself. It is the natural shape of threat. Lathbury rested his hand upon the bar. His fingernails were clean. His cuffs, though disguised, were of decent linen. A dockman's disguise, then worn by a man who would not risk his hands in honest labor. "Now," he said, "you will be so good as to come with us." "I am a watchmaker," I replied, "not a courier." "And yet you have delivered yourself on time," he said. "Curious how trade extends when the incentive is proper." "And what is the incentive?" I asked. He glanced around the room as if embarrassed to talk of money among such company. "Your continued possession of lungs," he said lightly. The pale grey scarf leaned in and spoke with a grin that showed a broken tooth. "Come quiet, little clockman. We don't want to spill your guts in front of the lady." "Lady," the barmaid repeated from behind the counter without looking up. "Call me that again, and I'll crack your head with a bottle." Lathbury did not turn. "No fuss," he said, and there was a note in his voice that made even the scarfed man's grin falter. I rose slowly. "Where?" I demanded. "Warehouse 17, said Lathbury. "A modest place, dry, private. You will appreciate it." "I appreciate my shop," I said. "You won't," said the raven scarf, "when we're finished with your fingers." It was said too casually. That was the worst of it. Violence in their mouths was not passion. It was procedure. Lathbury watched me as I stood. "Bring the box," he instructed. "And if I refuse?" I asked, keeping my voice steady by force. He regarded me as one regards a faulty lever. "Then you become a broken part," he said, "and we replace you." The phrase, so mechanical, struck my mind like a hammer. My anger flashed again. "I'm not a part," I said. "No?" His smile was faint. "Then why do you move when I speak?" Before I could answer, a voice from the far side of the room, light, amused, cut into the tight circle like a knife into soft fruit. "Because, Mr. Lathbury, you have surrounded him with men who smell of cheap bay rum and expensive fear." Every head turned. At a small table near the hearth sat a man I had not noticed. He wore the rough coat of a laborer and held a glass as if he were a regular. His face was half in shadow. Yet his eyes, when they lifted, had that cold brightness I remembered from my shop years ago. He spoke again, smiling a little. "You see, Mr. Pendleton, the advantage of learning to observe is that you may begin to choose when to be obedient." My heart thudded. Whole! He raised a finger, and the single gesture silenced me more completely than Lathbury's threats. Lathbury's pallor deepened by a degree, as if some internal calculation had been disturbed. "And who," he asked softly, "might you be?" The man by the hearth took a slow sip from his glass. "A poor fellow who dislikes bullies," he said, "and one who is, how do you phrase it, inconveniently alive." The room seemed to inhale. One of the scarfed men muttered, "It's him." Lathbury's eyes never left the newcomer. "Sherlock Holmes," he said, and the name carried neither awe nor disbelief, only recognition, like a man naming a tool he had hoped was lost. Holmes inclined his head. "At your service, though I confess, Mr. Lathbury, your service is not what it once was." The raven scarf spat on the floor. "We should have slit him at the falls." Holmes's smile widened a fraction. "An opinion shared by many," he said. "Unfortunately, you all lack imagination in geology." Lathbury's hand moved slightly behind his coat. I saw with sudden clarity the stiff line at his right side, something held close. A pistol. Holmes spoke on, as if pistols were conversational trifles. "Now then, let us be businesslike. You have my beetle." A murmur ran through the scarfed men. The pale grey scarf said, "Your beetle! We saw it come out o' that box." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "and a fine box it is, made of Honduras mahogany, not English, with brass fittings of naval manufacture. You will observe, Mr. Pendleton, if you keep your eyes where they belong, that the screws on the corner plates are aligned. A maker's vanity. A maker's vanity is a signature." I could not help myself. My gaze flicked to the satchel at my side. He was right. The box's workmanship was too precise for common trade. Lathbury's lip curled. "Are we to have a lecture?" "No," said Holmes. "You are to have an explanation. You have always been fonder of explanations after you have failed." The pale grey scarf stepped forward. "We can cut his throat." Holmes's eyes slid to the man's scarf. "You may try," he said pleasantly. "But if you do, you will bleed on your own silk." The scarfed man hesitated. Holmes leaned forward, elbows on his knees, as if the matter amused him. "Let us deduce, shall we? Your scarf is silk Italian, not English. It smells faintly of camphor, used to protect it from moths. Yet you are not a gentleman. The knots are clumsy. Your hands are nicked and stained at the fingertips. Not dock work, not knife work, acid work." The man's face tightened. "What's that to you?" "It means," Holmes continued, "that you handle etching fluid, that you cut plates, that you have been employed, likely at the Royal Mint's contractors in the last year, before you were dismissed. A man dismissed from precise work is dangerous. He believes the world owes him the discipline he was not given." The scarfed man's eyes widened. "How?" Holmes waved it away. "Your cuffs are marked by verdigris, brass filings, and you, Mr. Lathbury, your nails are clean, but your right thumb has a small bruise at the pad. You have been cocking a Webley revolver repeatedly in the last hour. Nervous habit. Your coat is dockside costume, but the linen at your throat is of superior weave. Your tobacco is Turkish. You have been in a club, recently, yesterday or today. You are not an East End man. You are a man who visits it." Lathbury's pale eyes were now hard as glass. "Talk," he said. "It will not save you." Holmes nodded. "Quite. The talking is for Mr. Pendleton." He looked at me then, and his expression changed just slightly into something like reassurance. "Mr. Pendleton," he said, "kindly take the beetle from your satchel and place it on that table by the window." I stared. They will not," Holmes replied, without raising his voice, "because I am asking, and because if they move too quickly they will learn something about their own nerves." The raven scarf laughed. "He's bluffing." Holmes's eyes flicked to him. "Perhaps," he said. "Do you wish to test the theory with your teeth?" The man shut his mouth. I swallowed, slid my hand into the satchel, and lifted the mahogany box. It felt suddenly like a live thing. I carried it to the table Holmes indicated and set it down. Lathbury's pistol came out. "Enough," he said, and pointed it not at Holmes but at me. "Open it." Holmes sighed. "Always the same, Lathbury. You stand behind other men as if they are furniture. That is why you will die behind furniture." The word die seemed to chill the air. I hesitated with the key in my hand. Holmes spoke quietly, for my ears alone. "Do as he says, but observe." I opened the box. The Opal Beetle lay in its velvet cradle, fire caught in stone. The gold legs were folded. It looked harmless until you knew it was not. Lathbury leaned forward, pistol steady. "The second," he said. "It is fitted," I replied, and my voice sounded strange to me, flat, obedient. Holmes chuckled. "Fitted, yes, by a man who knows the virtue of restraint. You, on the other hand, have never fitted anything in your life, Lathbury. You have only taken." Lathbury ignored the insult. "Pick it up. Wind it." Holmes raised a hand. "Allow me," he said. "I have always found that machines respond best to those who understand them." "You'll do what you're told," Lathbury snapped. Holmes rose then, smoothly, as if he were merely stretching his legs after a drink. In that movement there was something that made every man in the room feel, I think, that the game had changed. Holmes walked toward the table with hands open. "Very well," he said, "but let us be precise. You wish to test the Beetle upon a capsule of Admiralty numbers. You mean to extract tomorrow's minefield schedule, those charming little strings of figures that keep foreign vessels from drifting into British harbors uninvited." The Raven Scarf said, "He's guessing." Holmes shook his head. "No, I am reading. Your boots, for instance." The scarfed man glanced down, startled. Holmes pointed with his chin. "Wet with river mud, yes, but also flecked with fine chalk. Not dock chalk. School chalk. The kind used in map rooms. You have been in a place where men draw coastlines and write numbers on slates. You have been in a place of instruction." Lathbury's finger tightened on the trigger. "Shut your mouth," Holmes smiled. "You see, Mr. Pendleton, when a man says shut your mouth, it is usually because his own mouth has been too busy boasting." He took the Beetle gently between thumb and forefinger, as a watchmaker would. He did not need a loop. He merely glanced, and I saw his gaze take in the datum mark, the seam, the tiny screws. "A charming bit of horology," he said. "Who built it? Not you, Lathbury. Your hands are too soft. Not the scarfed gentleman either. Their fingers are too thick." The pale grey scarf bristled. "We can still break you." "Oh, certainly," Holmes replied. "But I should dislike the waste. For example, your scarf knot is the sailor's bowline, taught in the Navy. Yet you are no sailor. You learned it in training, perhaps, before you were discharged. The way you stand, left foot slightly forward, weight-balanced infantry training. But your shoulders are not those of a man who carried a rifle long. You were clerical. Naval clerk, perhaps. Discharged for drink, then recruited for resentment." The scarfed man's face went a sickly color. Lathbury barked, "Enough!" Holmes's tone sharpened at last. "It is enough," he agreed. "Now listen. You have made an error so elementary that I am almost embarrassed to point it out." "What error?" Lathbury hissed. Holmes held up the Beetle. "You believe it is only a key." "It is a key," Lathbury said. "It is also a witness," Holmes replied. It records, it remembers, and it has already remembered you. The raven scarf laughed again, nervously this time. It's a trinket. Holmes looked at him. You call it a trinket because you do not know how to be afraid of small things. Yet small things are the most dangerous. A germ, a spark, a single loose tooth in a gear train. He turned to me. Mr. Pendleton, do you see the minute scratch upon the second gear? Yes, I said, though I had not looked for it now. I put it there, Holmes said. A signature. Now observe, if that gear is removed and replaced even by an identical copy, the beetle will not tick in the same cadence. That cadence imperceptible to them has been noted elsewhere. Lathbury's eyes narrowed. Elsewhere, Holmes's smile returned. A place you would rather not visit. A little room with clean white tiles and men who do not wear silk. One of the scarfed men swore. Police, Holmes nodded. Not the common constable, Mr. Pendleton. Specialists, quiet men. They are outside now. I felt my throat tighten. Outside. Holmes did not glance toward the door. They entered the alley when Lathbury entered this room, he said. Because I knew Lathbury's punctuality. He cannot resist arriving precisely when he believes himself in control. Lathbury swung the pistol toward Holmes. You're lying. Perhaps, Holmes replied, and in the same instant he flicked his wrist. The beetle flew, not at Lethbury's face, but onto the tavern floor between two tables. It landed, clicked, and began to tick. Tick, tick, tick. Fast, eager. Then it crawled, not randomly, toward the door. Every eye in the room followed it, foolishly, as if the thing had become the center of gravity. Holmes moved. He was suddenly behind the pale grey scarf, and with a twist of his wrist he had seized the man's scarf and pulled it tight across his throat. Using the silk like a the man choked, eyes bulging, and Holmes murmured in his ear, almost kindly, "Silk is practical, you see." The raven scarf lunged at Holmes. Holmes released the pale grey scarf, stepped aside, and drove his elbow into the raven scarf's ribs with a precision that spoke of practice. The man folded, wheezing. Lathbury fired. The shot cracked like a whip. Glass burst somewhere above the bar. The room erupted, men shouting, chairs scraping, the fiddle's tunes strangled into silence. Holmes seized my coat with one hand. "Down!" he snapped. I dropped, more by instinct than sense, as a second shot tore the air above my head and punched splinters from the table. Holmes dragged me behind an upturned bench with surprising strength. "Do you have the box?" he demanded. "It's," I stammered, "on the table." "Then you have nothing," he said sharply. "Never leave your life on a table, Mr. Pendleton." Lathbury shouted, "Get the clock, man!" The barmaid screamed something obscene and hurled a bottle. It shattered against a scarfed man's shoulder, sending him staggering. Holmes' voice came, calm as ever, through the chaos. "Lathbury, you are aiming too high. Your right shoulder drops before you fire." A third shot cracked. It struck the bar, sending wood chips into the air like hail. "You talk too much, Holmes." Lathbury roared. Holmes laughed. "It is my principal fault." Through the smoke and panic, I saw the beetle still crawling toward the door, ticking all the while. It reached the threshold and stopped, as if waiting. Holmes's eyes followed mine. "There is your cue," he said. "When a machine tells you where to go, you may trust it more than men." He shoved me forward. We broke from cover and ran, not toward the main door, where bodies surged, but toward a side passage I had not noticed before, a narrow gap behind the bar, where casks were stacked. Lathbury shouted again. A hand seized my sleeve, but Holmes struck it away with his cane. Where had he got a cane? And the cane's head was not wood, but metal, heavy, fitted for purpose. "Warehouse 17, Holmes said in my ear, breathless now. "He is leading you to his own gallows. Delicious, isn't it?" We burst through the side door into fog. Outside, the air was colder, and the noise of the tavern dulled behind us. Footsteps pounded in the alley. The silk-scarved shadows were coming. Holmes pulled me into the lane and hissed, "Now, Pendleton, do what you do best. Count." "Count what?" "Steps," he said. "The distance to the corner. The time between their footfalls, their breath. They are not accustomed to running in mud." We ran. The fog swallowed everything except sound our own breathing, the slap of boots on wet stone, the quick whispers of silk behind us. Chapter 8. Warehouse 17. At the next corner a dark shape loomed Warehouse 17. Its painted number was scuffed as before. Holmes pressed my shoulder. "Inside," he said. The door was ajar as if the building itself had been waiting. We slipped in, and the darkness swallowed us. Behind, the scarfed men's footsteps closed. Holmes moved with confidence, as if he had walked these crates in daylight. He struck a match. A lantern flared, already filled, already ready. "This is your stage," he murmured. "Now watch the actors." The scarfed men burst in, dragging Lathbury with them. Lathbury's pistol was still in his hand, but his face was white with fury. Holmes stood by the trestle table as if it were his own parlour. "Good evening," he said. "You are precisely on time." Lathbury aimed. "I'll put you down like a dog." Holmes tilted his head. "You may attempt it," he said, "but you will find that your pistol has become unreliable." Lathbury's finger jerked. The pistol clicked. No shot. His face contorted. "What?" Holmes nodded toward the table. "Mr. Pendleton, would you kindly explain misfires to these gentlemen? They have never taken a mechanism apart without breaking it." I stared. "I haven't touched his." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Not you. The damp—" He lifted Lathbury's pistol from the air with a sudden movement so swift I barely saw it, caught the barrel, and tossed it onto the table. "Observe," Holmes said. "The oil in your chamber is too thin. It has wicked moisture. A man who visits the docks but does not belong to them forgets how damp insinuates itself into metal. Your cartridges are good. Your gun is good. Your maintenance is not." Lathbury lunged, but one of the scarfed men held him back, panicked now. "Why?" demanded the raven scarf, wheezing. "Why are you here?" Holmes's smile was sharp. "Because you have been stealing from the Admiralty," he said. "Because you are attempting to sell minefield schedules to a foreign agent whose name I shall not mention in mixed company. Because you believe yourselves clever." He leaned forward slightly. "And because you are wrong." The pale grey scarf, throat raw, spat on the floor. "We had the code. We had the capsule. We had the beetle. We had it. Holmes nodded. You had it, he agreed. And by having it, you gave me precisely what I wanted. Lathbury sneered. A toy. A chronicle, said Holmes. He turned to me. Mr. Pendleton, the beetle you saw is not merely a cipher engine. It is a recording instrument. It keeps within its opal body a memory of each setting applied to it, each pressure, each heat, each proximity to certain metals. I blinked. Proximity. Holmes nodded. In your trade, you call it magnetism when a balance behaves badly after contact with steel. Here, the principle is employed with rather more imagination. The beetle's spindle is fitted with a minute piece of treated iron. It responds to fields. It responds to the presence of keys, weapons, safes. It is, in short, a compass for guilt. The raven's scarf barked a laugh. Rubbish. Holmes's eyes flicked to the man's scarf. Your scarf pin, he said. It is not brass, it is nickel. Bought at a pawnbroker in Limehouse. You used it to pick a lock last night. There is a trace of blue paint at the tip. The same blue paint used on Admiralty dispatch cases. The man's mouth fell open. Holmes continued, his voice calm, his words falling like clockwork. And your boots carry chalk from a map room. And your cuffs are stained with printer's ink, not common ink, but the sort used in restricted presses. You have been copying schedules, not merely reading them. He glanced at Lathbury. And you, Lathbury, have a tiny burn on your left glove. A cigarette burn? No. A chemical burn. You have handled the etching acid used to remove markings from stolen plates. You are not the leader, despite your pistol. You are the broker, the intermediary, the man who thinks he is safe because he is useful. Lathbury's face was a mask of hatred. You can't prove any of this. Holmes' smile returned. Can't I? He reached into his coat and produced, be of all things, a small metal capsule like the one I had opened before. He set it on the table. Inside, he said, is the strip of figures you so urgently require. A duplicate. I anticipated your appetite. The scarfed men leaned forward involuntarily. Holmes held up the Opal Beetle, which had somehow returned to his possession. Perhaps he had snatched it in the alley. I had not seen. Now, he said, we will allow you to satisfy your curiosity. Mr. Pendleton wind it. My hands trembled, yet the act was familiar now. I fitted the tiny key and turned, half a turn, no more. The beetle clicked, its antennae lifting. Holmes placed it upon the capsule's paper strip. It began to crawl. It paused, ticked, adjusted. Its dorsal index turned, pointing to marks so fine they might have been imagined. Holmes watched it, head slightly inclined, like a man listening to music he knows. Lathbury's voice was strained. Read it, he demanded of me. Read it! Holmes's eyes did not leave the beetle. He will read only what I permit him to read, he said, because the second gear, your precious second, has been altered. He looked at me. Mr. Pendleton, you noticed a scratch upon the tooth, a signature. I put it there. But I also, at a later time, added a second scratch. Very slight. Invisible to a man who does not know where to look. That scratch changes the cadence by a hair. He held Lathbury's gaze. The beetle will still produce letters. It will still. Good work, but it will also, at every setting, create a pattern which I have already taught certain men to recognize. A pounding came suddenly at the warehouse door. "Holmes!" a voice called. "Are you in there?" Holmes's eyes brightened. "There it is," he said softly. The other hand winding the spring. The door burst open, and into the lantern light stepped two men plain clothes, broad-shouldered, with the hard look of those who have spent years dealing with violence without enjoying it. Behind them I glimpsed the flash of a constable's helmet. Lathbury snarled. "Police!" Holmes lifted a hand. "Not police," he corrected. Men who understand that sometimes the law must arrive quietly, lest it be too late. The scarfed men moved as if to run, but one of the plain-clothes men leveled a revolver, and his voice was as flat as a bench. "Stay where you are," he said, "or I'll make you." Holmes sighed, as if the business bored him. "Gentlemen," he said to the scarfed man, "you may consider yourselves wound down." Lathbury's eyes burned. "You used him," he spat, jerking his chin at me. "A watchmaker. A nobody." Holmes turned to him, and his tone sharpened into something like contempt. "I used his honesty," he said. "You, on the other hand, used his fear. That is the difference between a man and a rat." The plainclothes men seized the scarfed villains, hands wrenched behind backs. The silk scarves, those proud, whispering uniforms, were pulled away and used now as nothing more than cloth. As they struggled, the pale grey scarf shouted, "It weren't him! It was the foreigner, the one with the ring." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Ah," he said softly, "so there is another wheel in the train." He looked at me. "Mr. Pendleton, do you see how easily men begin to confess when the escapement is removed?" I could not answer. My throat was thick. The beetle, still on the paper strip, made a final quick tick-tick-tick, and then stopped, folding its legs. Holmes picked it up with care and returned it to its velvet cradle. He closed the mahogany lid and turned the key, pocketing it with a practiced motion. Then, as the villains were dragged toward the door, Lathbury twisted his head back. "This ain't over," he hissed. "You'll slip one day, Holmes. Everyone slips." Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes," he said, "but I make a habit of choosing where I slip. Good night, Mr. Lathbury." When the warehouse was quiet again, Holmes turned to me. "You are pale, Mr. Pendleton." "I am a watchmaker," I said hoarsely. "Not this." Holmes's eyes softened by a fraction. "And that is why you were necessary," he said. "A professional liar cannot recognize truth when he holds it. A professional thief cannot recognize an honest tool when he sees one. But you—" He tapped the mahogany box lightly. "You are a man who knows when a part fits, and you know when it does not." I swallowed. "Then what was their plan? Truly?" Holmes leaned back against a crate, hands behind him as if in his Baker Street chair. The lantern light drew sharp lines on his face. "The Admiralty has been improving its harbour defences," he said. "Mines, controlled by schedules and signals. The schedules are changed, frequently, and distributed in cipher. A small group of men, your silk-scarved shadows, set themselves to steal those schedules and sell them. They required a mechanical means to decipher in the field without carrying an obvious codebook. He lifted the beetle's box slightly. So I gave them one. You gave it to them, I repeated, still struggling with the cold cunning of it. I gave them a thing they could not resist, Holmes said, and I gave it to them through you, because you are invisible. A gentleman in a club is seen, a watchmaker in Whitechapel is not. The word stung. Holmes's gaze met mine. I do not mean it as insult. Invisibility, Mr. Pendleton, is a form of armor. You wore it without knowing. And the Beetle recorded them, I said. Holmes nodded. It recorded their settings, their hands, their proximity to certain metals. It recorded where it had been by the chemical trace of air and damp within its casing. A chronicle, when it returned to me by means already arranged, it brought its story. The rest was routine. I let out a breath I had been holding for hours. Then it's finished. Holmes's smile was wry. Finished? No. Merely concluded, he said. A watch ends its cycle and begins again. The world is much the same. He stepped closer and placed his hand briefly on my shoulder. It was a light touch, awkward, as if he did not often remember to be human. You will go back to your shop, he said. You will mend watches. You will sleep, and if you ever hear a tick that does not belong to any honest clock, you will know that somewhere a dishonest man is winding his own spring. He paused. You have done well, I managed at last. Will you tell Dr. Watson? Holmes laughed softly. Certainly not, he said. He would put it in print, and then every villain in Europe would begin carving opals. He took up the mahogany box. Besides, Mr. Pendleton, you have written it already in your own hand. He tipped his cap, and in that simple gesture I saw, for a moment, the man I had once served across my counter. Then he turned and went out into the fog with the easy disappearance of one who has made it his trade. I remained in the warehouse a moment longer, listening to the ordinary sound of men moving, of ropes shifting, of distant river water slapping wood. And over it all, in my mind, I heard the beetle's fast, eager rhythm, its small argument against chaos, turned now to the service of order. Tick, tick, tick. It sounded, for the first time since the adventure began, almost like relief. Thank you for listening to the Classic Audiobooks. Like, share, and subscribe to support our work and make sure you don't miss any new releases. New audiobooks are added every week,